What do you mean? What?
We are now live. Welcome,
Hey!
everyone. It's Curtis Anderson, and I've brought my friends Dean and Scott. You may remember them from our creativity hangout about a year and a half ago. Today's broadcast is unofficially brought to you by Deschutes Brewery. Deschutes. Renee and I like to eat and drink there, and you can get their beer in bottles. So today we have a very important discussion to bring up before the 4th of July weekend. As you may have seen in the things that I've posted before, I have more time for myself nowadays, and I've been using that time to read and do the things that I used to not have time for. And the question is, will my next book, possibly series of books, be the Dark Tower series by Stephen King? Will it be? Will it be? Now, as I mentioned in the live video on Facebook just a few minutes ago, this has been touted as one of King's best series. And it's also been touted as one of his worst works. That's why Dean and Scott are here with me today. Dean is an advocate for the Gunslinger, and Scott may or may not be. We actually don't know. And our biggest detractor, the one who had the strongest opinions about the whole thing, author Jeff Garvin, author of Symptoms of Being Human, and a forthcoming book that we don't have the title for, will not be joining us today. He has been invited. We've encouraged him to come. I just don't know if he's going to be there. Now, for those of you who don't know, The Gunslinger and the Dark Tower film is coming out later this year, starring Idris Elba and our favorite character from that 70s movie, Dazed and Confused, Matthew McConaughey. So, fellas, how do we feel about The Gunslinger and, in general, getting started on what is a 7-book undertaking, not unlike hitting Harry Potter for the first time?
I'm curious where Scott stands on this.
So I only got about halfway through it from the time you mentioned it and the time I got home from work. So, you know, I only had time to listen to about half of it because I'm audiobooking it. And unfortunately, the quality of the audiobook I have is not great, so I could only get up to 2.5 times. But you know,
just so everybody knows, we came up with the idea to even have this conversation about 3 hours ago. So that's how far Scott's gotten in three hours, and that's pretty good. That's pretty strong.
Well, what's your initial impression there, Scott?
you know, I figured it would be interesting being about halfway through it to get to talk about it, because it definitely has. I don't know how to put it. It's
well. First, before you go any farther, how much Stephen King have you read?
a lot.
Okay.
I burned through a ton of his stuff when I was younger. You know, everything from like what is it, The Darker Half, Tommyknockers, It, you know, The Stand, all that stuff. His short stories are actually my favorite, but like Skeleton Crew and those, like the short story collections. He's you know, he's always, all of his stuff I've found is good. I haven't regretted reading anything from him. There's definitely stories I like better. Like I really enjoyed Tommyknockers, which is funny because a lot of people really don't like Tommyknockers. And I think Jeff probably hates it because it's another book where it's just constantly something seems to probably should happen but never does.
Yep.
Which I think was his biggest complaint about this book, not to put words in his mouth since he's not here, but he was ranting quite a bit, so I think we can safely say that his view was that it kind of just had that something's going to happen but never quite does. I find it's this particular, the Gunslinger has that same sort of surreal magical realism quality to it. where you're never quite sure, like, is this whole thing just sort of a weird ongoing allegory, or what exactly is happening? How bad are we going to do spoilers in this, by the way?
Well, I would prefer no spoilers, since it's likely I'm going to read this no matter what now. It's just whether or not it's the exact next thing I read. So I'd prefer not to have any spoilers. And ideally, people are kind of checking this out to see if it's something they want to check out too, especially before the film. So, and as a heads up, apparently the film is a sequel to the book series. So,
which makes no sense to anyone that probably hasn't seen the or read the books, because well, I won't. There's a lot of spoilers I can say. Yeah.
I feel like a whole separate spoiler chat is going to happen in like 2 weeks when I'm done with, or I guess it won't take me very long. In my ignorance of the book, it's a small one for King. I mean, considering the ones that I normally read, it
wasn't a book, so it didn't start out as a book. It started out as a short, I don't know what you'd call them, just sort of very short stories or parts of stories that were originally published in magazines. I think it was like a fantasy or sci-fi magazine, and they were chapters, and they would come out like every 6 months or something. They'd be the next chapter of the book.
Yeah, it definitely has a feel, that serial feel. Where it's...
Yeah. Green Mile was actually released like that, I believe, in the 90s, early 2000s. They released, each part. I think it was 6, 9 parts, something like that. And they released them like every month or every 2 months or something.
I really enjoyed consuming Green Mile that way. That really works.
Oh, I did, especially. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, is this something where I'm going to be able to feel the like the sections? Is it almost appropriate to read it in sections like that, or is this a binge read and that'll work out just fine?
So it's good to approach the book knowing it was written that way. But I think, if someone had given me the Green Mile all together, all at once, I would have consumed it straight. And I don't think it wouldn't have hurt. It's just one of those things. We have this in TV shows now, where we binge watch TV shows as opposed to waiting a week. And there's something to be said about waiting in between episodes. And the same thing with the Green Mile. Like, you really sit and think about what you just read, and you have to think, and maybe if you're reading it with somebody, you get the chance to talk about it and discuss it before you continue on. I think that's one thing that's really missing in TV shows these days. We had a lot of fun, every week at work when we watched Lost, because there were so many things that we could talk about with each episode, and we had a whole week to discuss before the next one came out. And when you binge watch something now, or binge read in this case, you don't have that time to pause and really reflect on what you just read.
And that's interesting that you bring up, because when I was thinking about picking this one up, part of the reason why I was picking it up was because I just finished reading the new Star Wars novel Thrawn that just came out. And for Star Wars fans, it's the canon way that we see Grand Admiral Thrawn, who became famous in the original trilogy of books, Heir to the Empire, His Last Command. It was the continuation of Star Wars when we didn't know if we were getting any Star Wars or not again in the mid-90s. And it was because of the action in that book that I kind of changed my mind from what I was intentionally going to read before, which was Aziz Ansari's Modern Romance, which just seemed like, I believe it, especially from just the foreword that I read, but it felt like it was putting the brakes too hard on my brain now wanting, Star Wars, Indiana Jones style action, right? So, and that's why I was coming to this. So
okay, this is not that, by the way.
Yeah,
especially the first
action. Yeah, this is not an action book.
This is a slow burn, and it really is a focus on introducing you to the world, and introducing you to who the Gunslinger is. And it feels more like a God, what's a good analogy? It's like the intro to the series. This is the introduction. This whole book is the introduction, and it's getting you started into this crazy, weird thing. So it's the juxtaposition of this book with what comes later is stark. This whole series gets insane, and it ramps fantasy up to 11. And you would never guess it from this book. That's why I'm really sad that Jeff's not here, because he's only read this book. And I can understand if you stopped at the end of this book and you look back and you're like, if the whole series is like this, no thank you. When I first read this in 1997, it was rough to get through. I was looking, coming off a Thrawn and coming off an action-based a book, this is going to be very disappointing. It's a very slow burn that you never really appreciate until you read the rest of the series. And in fact, if you read the rest of the series and go read this one again, you'll have, I'd put money on it, that you'd have a completely different view of what this book is, what it was trying to say, and how you feel about it.
Mm. Well, and that's actually something that I want to touch on as well, is the fact that I don't have the original version of this book. I have the revised and expanded version that was released through the Stephen King Library.
I believe this is the original. If it's not, it's only been slightly abridged. The audio, I found a website that had the audio version of King reading it in 1982.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's the original. Yeah,
that would be original.
Some of the differences. I did look up what the differences were between the different versions.
Okay, yeah. I'm curious what they are.
Well, basically, he went back and changed a few things to make it line up better with the series.
Okay.
Because because it wasn't originally designed to be a prequel, basically.
Yeah.
So he went back and sort of tweaked stuff, added a little more foreshadowing in places and that kind of stuff.
Did a Tolkien-like retcon to make things kind of work a little bit better with the follow-up?
Right.
Nice.
I wouldn't say it's a prequel as much as it's just an introduction. But words.
Yeah, it's almost a character study.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's what's great about it. Like you read it, and if you know anything about King, you can see him at his early stages, fleshing things out. And he obviously didn't. He had been published by this time, but maybe he hasn't. I don't know too much of the history of this, but I'm pretty sure he had already had books written by the time this was published for the first time. And it almost felt like he didn't want to publish this as a book so much as he just wanted to experiment and throw it in get it out there, maybe get some feedback through a fantasy magazine, and not try and release it to the general public. And then he really loved these characters and really loved this stuff, and so later on he ended up creating what happened next in the Drawing of the Three, which is a fantastic book.
Mm. My dad really likes the Drawing of the Three as well. I mean, the recommendations have been overwhelmingly positive for this series, but it does feel like everybody's fondness does start at book 2.
Yeah, I mean, you could in fact start at book 2 and probably be a little confused at the beginning, but it wouldn't harm your enjoyment of the things that came later. I'd say the Gunslinger is a quick read at 200 pages, and it sets up everything to come later. Jeff in our little chat, he gave you the summary, and really it is what happens.
And for those who may be wondering, Jeff's summary was, here's the gunslinger, he's walking, he's in the desert, it's hot, there's a bird, bird's gone, he walks, it's hot, it's the desert, here's the bird again, is something going to happen? No, book ends. So,
well, yeah, there's a little more to it. He meets somebody, and then he continues, and
yes, he walks.
Things happen. I would say that summary is not good enough. But if you want a summary, it's slightly spoilerish. But I mean, there's a twist in there. I mean, it's not like nothing happens. There's characters, and they meet, and things happen, and you don't really expect that to go that way, and then things happen afterwards, and you're like, wow, okay.
Dean, it sounds like you're dating on a Saturday night.
I would agree that it's a little Tolkien-esque in the fact that, there'll be like these long involved descriptions of the grassland as he walks into it, or
oh yeah,
there's definitely some of that, which I know I think that's part of why Jeff hates it too.
Yep.
So, but it definitely does talk a lot. It's trying to set up the atmosphere, I think, for the whole, and that's really where a lot of what this book does, I think. And I haven't read the rest of the series. It's one I've somehow missed, out of the Stephen King library. I think because I stopped reading Stephen King by the time it became popular. By the time he revisited it, and I just never got back into it. I was reading more hard sci-fi type stuff by then. But it's one I've meant to go back and do. But you can definitely see him setting up, he's got a love for the world that you feel with Tolkien as well, where he's describing just in vivid detail, not only the people, but the environment is a character almost. And Stephen King, a lot of times, the environment is a character in his books.
Yeah. That was the first thing I remember hearing about King before I ever read him was, wow, did he ever describe everything and paint that crazy picture of where these characters lived, to a fault in a lot of people's eyes.
Yeah, but it makes it real easy to imagine what Derry looks like, what Castle Rock looks like.
I mean,
it
depends on how much action do you want versus how much descriptions do you want.
Right. Stephen King, I don't see Stephen King as a big action writer.
No, he's definitely not.
Yeah, his stuff is definitely more, he's alien, not aliens.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Still good.
Yeah.
You love them in different ways.
Yeah, but it's the sort of the more the suspense, you're not looking for just action sequences. Although, there are some, but it's that slow sort of steady build of the world that you really get with Stephen King. Like The Stand is an excellent one too for that.
Oh yeah.
There's all these characters and there's all this description of the world, so you feel it's lived in. If you know what I mean.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of what drew us into the original Star Wars, right? There was nothing pristine about those ships. It was a real universe that you felt like you could step into it, and it wasn't there wasn't that barrier to entry. Yeah. All right. Well, after 20 minutes of discussion, guys, I feel like I'm probably just going to burn through Modern Romance because it is also a pretty short book. This isn't going to take me very long to read. That's also going to give me time to get the Drawing of the Three, which I don't have yet. So I can bust out the Gunslinger and then the Drawing of the Three back to back, because it sounds like that's probably the best way to do it.
Definitely. And if you need it, I know you were just down here, but I do have it. But I think having the collection, you know what? It's funny that you brought this up because I've been thinking for a while now. I need to reread the series. I mean, I read all of those books when I was in college, so that was early '90s or mid '90s, and I remember I read all of them up until Wizard and Glass, and Wizard and Glass came out in '97.
Right.
And then I had to wait. I remember I just had to wait. I think it was only like a few months, but the difference between those two books, the releasing was, I think it was almost 10 years. It was a huge amount of time between book 3 and book 4. And so people were just like,
time with this. Yeah.
And book 3 ended on a big cliffhanger. And so to think like you had to wait years and years before you got the answers to what happened was crazy.
It's what people are going through with Song of Ice and Fire before Song of Ice and Fire.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And if I'm correct, this is a 7-book series. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah, I wanna
I believe
see
it's 7. Let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes. Oh, actually 8 because I believe there's one.
That's on its way.
No. It's Wind Through the Keyhole, which is kind of a in between book 4 and 5, which I would definitely suggest reading in order between book 4 and 5, because it literally happens between those two books, even though a lot of it is kind of flashbacky and whatnot.
Mm.
And Wizard and Glass too. I mean, one of the worst things about Wizard and Glass, so it's a span of, I don't know, it was 8 years or whatever between the two books. Almost all of Wizard and Glass is a flashback.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. People were pissed. We got a little bit of resolution of the current timeline story, but most of it was, Roland the Gunslinger, and before you see him in the Gunslinger, the first book, it was kind of that was a prequel, if anything, and which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is told in this book right here, which is the comic book by Jay Lee, with amazing Jay Lee art in it, comic style.
Nice.
So the beautiful thing is, once you finish the stories, there's a lot of these graphic novels, comic books, that give you even more story. A lot of them, I believe, if not all of them, are based. I haven't read all of them yet, but most of them are based in the before the Gunslinger. So it's all about Roland before he became the Roland that we know, which is really cool. Nice.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. I want to thank our lurker, Dan, who was unable to join us.
Cheers, Dan.
In video and in conversation today because of his location. But it was a pleasure to speak with you guys. I do think I've got this down, and it looks like this summer I'm going to be reading some Stephen King Dark Tower series. Thanks again, guys. And Dean, where can we find you on the internet if people want to find you on the internet?
Well, I'm a art director and web designer. You can find me at daedesign.com.
Great. And then Scott, if people want to stalk you, is there a way they can do that?
Google Plus, just to be obnoxious.
All right. Well, I look forward to doing this again for whatever reason, and I'll see you later.
All right. Talk to you later.
See you.